Every now and then, I like to bring up the story from my past. And I know I spoke about it on older videos. Back when my son, he was in elementary, that school was like my second home. I was heavily involved in everything, and with me being there, I was able to meet a lot of the other parents and, get to know a lot of the parents there. I like to talk about or tell the story of the woman that I almost didn't become friends with because of what other people were saying about her. And I want you to think about that for a second. How many of you are guilty of this right now? How many of you listen to someone else's opinion about a person before you've even had a genuine interaction with them? No fact checking, no personal experience, just blindly going along with someone else's narrative. And then later on, you realize that the person everyone warned you about was never a problem at all. So you done went up against somebody, harassing them, whatever, and they weren't even the problem. The problem was the one you were actually listening to. I know how this feels. I get judged before people get to know me. The narrative is always the same. They judge first, but after, sitting down, talking, hanging out, then the story changes. They realize you're nothing like what people said. Back at that school, a group of mothers warned me to stay away from this woman. And, they would say, like, she's this way, she's that way, don't talk to her. It was never anything nice. I listened, but deep down, the Most High had other plans. It was placed on my heart to get to know her, to just ignore the crowd. Please ignore what these people are saying and see for yourself, sit down with this person. So I did that. I sat with her, I listened to her story, and it was no fairy tale. She had a very rough upbringing. She didn't have it easy at all. She had a very strong personality, very strong, intimidating personality, and people judged her because she was, loud, kind of seemed like she was always angry. But I saw someone who, never healed from that past pain. She was just someone who needed a chance. That woman ended up becoming one of my good friends, the kind of person who would literally give you the shirt off her back. And I'm so glad I chose to give her a chance instead of following the crowd. It makes me wonder, when you hear a name being dragged through the mud whenever a crowd forms, how do you know it's the truth? Once I started my journey, I was removing myself from unhealthy, toxic situations. All of a sudden, I was demonic. I was a witch. Just crazy, mentally unstable. These labels were coming from people that I had to remove myself from because they prioritized disrespect over love, because they lied or betrayed me. I had to heal from these people, saying my walk with God was fake. Oh my goodness. And, I was doing too much, you know. So I had to isolate, no contact. And people were still out here trying to paint me in a negative light. I was, speaking truth, and truth irritates a lot of people. They get uncomfortable. But I've never participated in any kind of witchcraft. I pray, I read my Bible, and I keep to myself. People assume they know you by a picture or maybe a video that you post. I remember one time getting into character on one of my little videos. It's just something I do. It's fun. I love music. I love all kinds of music. So sometimes I'll dress up and I just get into character. And I remember someone commenting, oh, it was demonic. It was nothing in that video demonic, by the way. But that's how the enemy works. He has to send people out to try to trigger you or get a reaction. There was nothing demonic about the video. Music just literally just brings out a very performative side of me. I like listening to music. I have fun. God is calling us to sit with the very people the world has turned their backs on. The ones who don't look the part. You're not popular. You don't have that expensive lifestyle. We are judging before we even know their names. Someone right now, you're going to miss out on a divine blessing or a beautiful opportunity because you're listening to people who are jealous. They're bitter. They're hurt. You know, maybe it's something on the job. A coworker is watching your rise with envy, and they're filling the boss's head with lies about your character. You know, your personal life, a friend is secretly jealous of your happiness, and they're trying to sabotage you or the people you associate with. This is a wake-up call where there's a pass around label put on a woman who is actually celibate. You know, they're minding their business. You know, get to know people for yourself. Don't let someone else's bitterness rob you of the connections God has waiting for you. That's the message. You know, I'm sharing this. You know, it's a word that needs to be heard. Be the person who looks past the noise. Be the person who sees the heart, not just the reputation.